During a devastating flood, a personal trainer risked his life to save a trapped elderly woman. When she whispered about her missing granddaughter, the doctor, his heart stopped as he realized this wouldn't be his only rescue that night. Last set, Jennifer. Push through it. David Parker's voice echoed through the nearly empty gym as rain began to patter against the windows. His client, a middle-aged woman in designer workout gear, struggled with her final shoulder press repetitions. The breaking news alert on his phone buzzed again. David glanced at it while spotting Jennifer. Severe flooding warning for Houston area. Residents advised to seek high ground. Okay, that's enough for today, he said, helping Jennifer rack the weights. We should both head home before this storm gets worse. Jennifer wiped her face with a towel. You sure? We still have 15 minutes. Trust me, when Houston floods, it floods fast. David's jaw tightened as memories of his father flashed through his mind. 10 years ago, another storm, another flood. His dad never made it home that night. As Jennifer gathered her things, David checked his voicemail. The automated message from Houston First Bank played again. Dear Mr. Parker, we regret to inform you that your business loan application has been denied due to insufficient collateral, and he deleted it before the message finished. Fourth rejection this year. His phone rang. Mom? David, honey, the power's flickering over here. His mother's voice sounded weaker than usual. And I'm not sure if I took my morning pills. David grabbed his gym bag, rushing toward the exit. Did you check the pill organizer I set up? I can't remember if I did or not. Okay, stay put. I'll swing by after my last client. He pushed through the gym doors into the humid air. Dark clouds loomed over the city skyline. Thunder rolled in the distance as David navigated his beat-up Honda Civic through Houston's 3rd Ward. The historic neighborhood's worn buildings and patched roads told stories of segregation, struggle, and resilience. Now, water was already pooling in the usual spots, reflecting the gray sky above. His phone buzzed again. Another weather alert. Flash flood warning upgraded. 12+ inches expected. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The same weather service had failed to predict the severity of the storm that killed his father. That night, James Parker had driven into rising waters to help a stranded family, just like he always did when people needed help. The current had swept his truck away. Traffic crawled as the rain intensified. David drummed his fingers on the wheel, watching the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. He needed to check on his mom, but first he had to secure his apartment. Every possession he owned was in there, and he couldn't afford flood insurance on a personal trainer's salary. The rain fell harder now, drumming against his car roof like thousands of tiny fists. Water crept up the curbs, and streams began forming in the streets. He turned onto Oak Lane, where century-old houses stood like weathered sentinels. Most had been divided into apartments, their wooden porches showing signs of neglect. That's when he heard it, a cry for help, barely audible over the rain. David slowed his car, rolling down the window despite the downpour. There was again, desperate, frightened. Through the sheets of rain, he saw her, an elderly black woman on her porch, clinging to a rusted railing as water rose around her feet. She wore a blue dress, now soaked through, her gray hair plastered to her face. Help! Somebody please! David pulled over to the highest spot he could find, his father's voice echoing in his head. Son, sometimes doing the right thing means doing the hard thing. The water was already ankle-deep when he stepped out of his car. Thunder cracked overhead, and the rain felt like ice against his skin. He could see the terror in the woman's eyes as the water continued to rise. His phone buzzed one final time before he stuffed it into a Ziploc bag. His mom again. David looked at the rising water, then at the frightened woman on the porch. The same choice his father had faced 10 years ago now stared him in the face. I'm coming, he shouted, hoping his voice carried over the storm. Hold on tight. The woman's response was drowned out by another crash of thunder, but David could read her lips. Please hurry. As he waded into the rising water, memories of his father's funeral flashed through his mind. The closed casket, his mother's tears, the pastor's words about sacrifice and courage. David pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the task at hand. One step at a time, The water was already at his knees, and he could feel the current strengthening. A car alarm blared in the distance, its electronic wail mixing with the storm's fury. More water poured from the sky, and David could see other houses beginning to flood. But right now, all that mattered was reaching that porch and the woman whose life depended on a stranger's courage. "What's your name?" he called out, trying to keep her focused as he made his way through the rising water. "Rose," she answered, her voice shaking. "Rose Williams, I'm David. I'm going to get you out of here, Mrs. Williams. Just hold on tight to that railing." The water reached his thighs now, and each step required more effort. Debris floated past, branches, trash, a child's toy. The current tugged at his legs, trying to pull him off course. 10 feet away from the porch now. 8 feet. 6. That's when he heard the distinct sound of wood cracking. The porch groaned under the assault of wind and water. Mrs. Williams screamed as the railing she clung to shifted slightly. "Don't move," David shouted, pushing forward with renewed urgency. "I'm almost there." The water was up to his waist, and his soaked clothes felt like lead weights. But he could see Mrs. Williams clearly now, the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as they gripped the failing railing, the cross necklace glinting at her throat. 5 feet to go. 4. 3. Another crack of thunder split the sky, and Mrs. Williams jumped, her grip loosening for just a moment. David lunged forward, his hand outstretched. The storm raged on, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath its fury. And in that moment, as water rose and wood groaned, David Parker faced the same choice his father had a decade ago, knowing that this time the ending might be different. The porch railing gave way with a sharp crack. Mrs. Williams screamed as she stumbled backward, water splashing around her ankles. David lunged forward, his muscles burning as he fought against the current. "I've got you," he shouted, grabbing her arm just as she started to fall. The water surged around them, now reaching their waists on the porch. "My medicine," Mrs. Williams gasped, trying to turn back toward her front door. "I need my—" "We'll come back for it," David said firmly, scanning the street for the safest route. His car sat on higher ground 50 yards away, but the current between them and safety looked treacherous. "Right now, we need to move." Thunder cracked overhead. The rain fell in sheets so thick David could barely see 10 feet ahead. He wrapped one arm around Mrs. Williams's shoulders, feeling her trembling against him. "Ready?" he asked, tightening his grip. "We're going to move slowly. Small steps." They made it 3 steps before the current knocked them both off balance. Mrs. Williams cried out as they stumbled, but David managed to grab a porch column, steadying them. "I can't," Mrs. Williams sobbed. "I can't swim." "You don't have to swim. Just hold on to me. I won't let go." A loud crash drew their attention down the street. A dumpster, carried by the flood waters, slammed into a parked car, setting off its alarm. The sound echoed through the storm, a warning of what the current could do. David's phone buzzed in its waterproof bag. "Mom again." He ignored it, focusing on their next move. The water had risen another inch in just the last few minutes. "We have to go now," he said. "The porch isn't safe." Mrs. Williams nodded, her fingers digging into his arm. They reached the porch steps where the current hit them full force. David's foot slipped on the submerged bottom step, and they both pitched forward. The flood water tasted like mud and gasoline. David kicked hard, fighting to keep their heads above water while maintaining his grip on Mrs. Williams. Her blue dress billowed around them as they were swept away from the porch. "Hold your breath," David shouted as another wave crashed over them. He spotted a fire hydrant ahead, partially submerged but still visible. If he could just reach it, his shoulder slammed into the hydrant with bone-jarring force. Pain shot through his arm, but he managed to wrap his free arm around the metal pole. Mrs. Williams coughed and sputtered beside him, but she was still conscious, still holding on. "Are you hurt?" he asked, blinking water from his eyes. "No," she gasped. "But my granddaughter, she's supposed to be coming. She's a doctor at Memorial Hermann. She doesn't know." Another wave hit them before she could finish. David's grip on the hydrant slipped. They were moving again, being pulled by the current toward a line of partially submerged cars. "What's her name?" David called out, trying to keep Mrs. Williams talking as he looked for their next anchor point. Your granddaughter? Sarah. Sarah Williams. Mrs. Williams coughed up water. She works late on Thursdays. She always comes to check on me after her shift. A half-submerged SUV loomed ahead of them. David managed to grab its side mirror, but the plastic housing cracked under their weight. They needed something more stable. Through the rain, he could see his car still sitting on the high ground. But between them and safety, the flood waters churned like rapids, carrying all manner of debris. A wooden fence panel rushed past, followed by a plastic garbage can. David. Mrs. Williams's voice held fresh terror. He followed her gaze to see what had frightened her. A sedan, parked further up the street, had started to move. The flood waters were lifting it, turning it slowly, inexorably, toward the house they'd just left, toward the porch where they'd been standing minutes ago. The car picked up speed as it moved with the current. It slammed into the porch supports with a sound like a gunshot. Wood splintered. The entire structure shuddered, then began to collapse. Thank God you came when you did, Mrs. Williams whispered. David didn't respond. He was too busy calculating their next move. The current was strongest in the center of the street, where it had become a raging river. But along the edges, where fences and hedges broke up the flow, Mrs. Williams, he said, we're going to move along these cars, like stepping stones. Can you do that? She nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear. Don't let go. Never. They began their slow journey, moving from car to car. Each step was a battle against the current. David's muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stay focused. One wrong move, one slipped grip, and they'd be swept away. A basketball floated past, followed by someone's mailbox. The water kept rising. What had been waist-deep was now chest-high on David, and nearly neck-high on Mrs. Williams. They were 3 cars away from higher ground when Mrs. Williams's strength began to fail. Her grip on David's arm weakened. I'm so tired, she mumbled. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. So cold. Hypothermia. The thought hit David like a physical blow. They needed to get out of the water now. Stay with me, he said, pulling her closer. Tell me about Sarah. What kind of doctor is she? Emergency medicine? Mrs. Williams's voice was faint. She works with trauma patients, like her daddy did, before he passed. She sounds amazing, just like her grandmother. 2 cars left. David's shoulder throbbed where he'd hit the hydrant, but he pushed the pain aside. The rain was falling harder now, if that was possible, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Almost there, he encouraged. Just a little, a massive wave of water, caused by who knew what upstream, slammed into them. David's grip on the car slipped. Mrs. Williams screamed. They were underwater again, tumbling in the current. David kicked hard, fighting to get their heads above water. His lungs burned. His muscles felt like lead. But he didn't let go of Mrs. Williams. He wouldn't let go. They surfaced gasping, now a full car length past where they'd been. But in the chaos, David had become disoriented. Which way was the high ground? Through the curtain of rain, he heard a new sound. A car engine. Headlights cut through the gloom. Help, he shouted, though his voice was hoarse. Over here! The headlights swung toward them. A woman's voice called out, Grandma? Oh my God, Grandma! David's heart jumped. Could it be? But before he could process what was happening, something large and hard struck him from behind. Stars exploded in his vision. Mrs. Williams's hand slipped from his grasp. The last thing he heard was someone screaming his name as the flood waters pulled him under. David's head broke the surface with a desperate gasp. His lungs burned as he gulped air, trying to orient himself in the churning water. The impact, probably a floating piece of debris, had knocked him at least 20 feet downstream. Mrs. Williams, he shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. Through the rain, he could still see the headlights of the car that had arrived. Mrs. Williams. A response came, but not from the elderly woman. Over here! She's over here! David spotted them. Mrs. Williams, clinging to a young woman in scrubs who had somehow managed to secure them both to a sturdy fence post. Sarah. It had to be Sarah. The current dragged at his legs as he tried to swim toward them. His shoulders screamed in protest with each stroke. The blow from whatever had hit him left his head pounding, and he could taste blood where he'd bitten his cheek. "Look out!" Sarah shouted. David turned just in time to see a massive tree branch bearing down on him. He dove, feeling it brush past his back as he went under. The muddy water stung his eyes, but he caught glimpses of more debris racing past in the current. Pieces of fencing, trash cans, a bicycle. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Water's got no mercy, son. You gotta respect it, but never trust it." Using the debris to his advantage, David grabbed onto passing objects, working his way across the current. A submerged mailbox, a trapped shopping cart. Each one brought him closer to Mrs. Williams and Sarah. "He's bleeding," he heard Sarah say as he got within earshot. "Mom, we need to get him to the hospital." "Not without David," Mrs. Williams gasped between chattering teeth. David reached them, grabbing the same fence post. Up close, he could see that Sarah had managed to secure a rope, probably from her car's emergency kit, around her grandmother's waist. "I'm okay," he said, though his vision swam slightly. "But we need to move. This fence won't hold much longer." As if to prove his point, the wood groaned under the water's assault. Sarah nodded, her professional training evident in her calm demeanor despite the chaos. "My car's on higher ground," she said, pointing to where her headlights illuminated the floodwaters. "About 30 feet. I've got another rope." David's phone buzzed again in its waterproof bag. His mother. How long had he been in the water? 20 minutes? 30? The sky was so dark with storm clouds he couldn't tell if the sun had set. "Give me the rope," he said. "I'll anchor it to something closer to your car. Make a line we can follow." Sarah pulled a coiled rope from where she'd tucked it into her scrub top to keep it dry. "You're hurt," she said, Dr. Mode fully engaged. "That cut on your head looks worse than it is." David took the rope. "Head wounds bleed a lot. Keep her warm. I'll be right back." He pushed out from the fence before either woman could protest. The current immediately grabbed him, but this time he was ready. He'd studied the water's flow pattern, spotted a route using various anchored objects. A partially submerged stop sign, a sturdy bush, a concrete barrier someone had put out for trash pickup. David moved from point to point, unwinding the rope as he went. His father had died, trying to save strangers from flood waters just like these. The memory hit him as he reached the next anchor point, a decorative boulder in someone's yard. Would anyone have blamed him if he'd stayed in his car? If he'd called 911 and waited for professionals? But he knew the answer. He would have blamed himself. "Almost there," Sarah called out encouragingly. She was good at that. Probably had lots of practice keeping patients calm in the ER. David reached the final obstacle between them and Sarah's car. A cluster of trees whose branches now swayed dangerously in the wind and water. He began securing the rope to the thickest trunk. That's when he heard the crack. It wasn't thunder. It was wood splitting. The fence Mrs. Williams and Sarah clung to was giving way. Sarah screamed as one of the posts torn loose. The section they held shifted, tilting dangerously. Mrs. Williams's feet slipped off whatever underwater purchase they'd found. David didn't think. He didn't plan. He just moved. The rope in his hands became a lifeline as he fought his way back through the current. His muscles felt like they were on fire. The cut on his head throbbed with each heartbeat. But none of that mattered. "Hold on," he shouted. "Both of you, hold on." The fence creaked again. Another post gave way. Sarah struggled to keep both herself and her grandmother above water while maintaining their grip on the failing structure. David was 10 feet away when Mrs. Williams lost her grip entirely. Sarah screamed as her grandmother's weight pulled against the rope around her waist. The current immediately began dragging them both away from the fence. 5 feet, 3 feet. David lunged forward, abandoning his own safety line to grab Mrs. Williams's outstretched hand. The current slammed them all against the remaining fence posts. "The rope!" Sarah gasped. "The one you tied off." Understanding hit him. David pulled them along the fence until his fingers found the rope he'd secured to the trees. "Grab on." Together, they began pulling themselves along the rope. The current fought them every inch of the way. Mrs. Williams was barely conscious now, her skin alarmingly cold to the touch. "Stay with us," Sarah kept saying. Come on, Grandma. Stay with us. A surge of water hit them broadside. David felt the rope burn against his palms as their grip slipped. But he held on. They all held on. Finally, blessedly, the water began to get shallower. Their feet found purchase on something solid, the raised curb that had kept this section of street above the floodwaters. Sarah's car sat 20 feet away, its headlights still cutting through the rain. But between their exhausted muscles and Mrs. Williams's condition, those 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles. Together, David said, shifting to better support Mrs. Williams's weight. One step at a time, Sarah nodded, her medical training warring with her obvious exhaustion. Count of three. 3, David said immediately, and they moved. Each step was a battle against wind, rain, and fatigue. Mrs. Williams tried to help, but her legs kept buckling. They had to half-carry, half-drag her through the knee-deep water. Almost there, Sarah encouraged. Come on, Grandma. Just a few more steps. David's vision blurred. The blow to his head was definitely making itself felt now. But he could see the car getting closer. 10 feet. 5 feet. They reached the car just as another massive wave of water surged down the street, carrying with it the fence they'd been clinging to minutes before. Sarah fumbled with her keys, then got the back door open. Get her in, David said. Get her warm. Together, they managed to lift Mrs. Williams into the back seat. Sarah immediately climbed in after her, already pulling emergency blankets from her medical bag. David stood in the rain, swaying slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. His phone buzzed again. Mom, he needed to get in. Sarah's voice cut through his daze. You're not walking away with a head injury. Get in the car. Now. He looked at the flooding street, thought about his own car parked a block away, about his apartment, probably flooding now, about his mother, waiting for him to check on her. But Sarah was right. In his condition, he'd be lucky to walk 10 feet, let alone drive anywhere. Besides, he couldn't leave until he knew Mrs. Williams would be okay. David climbed into the passenger seat just as another wave of water swept past the car. In the back seat, he could hear Sarah talking to her grandmother, her voice shifting between professional doctor and worried granddaughter. BP's low but stable. You're going to be fine, Grandma. Need to get you warmed up. I've got you. His own mother's face flashed through his mind. She'd be worried sick by now. But as he pulled out his phone to call her, his vision swam again. The last thing David saw before consciousness slipped away was Mrs. Williams's hand reaching forward from the back seat to squeeze his shoulder. A silent thank you from the woman he'd risked everything to save. Sir? Can you hear me? Sir? David's eyes fluttered open to bright fluorescent lights and the steady beep of medical equipment. A nurse in blue scrubs stood over him, checking his vital signs. What? His throat felt raw. Where am I? Memorial Hermann Emergency Department, the nurse said. Dr. Williams brought you in. You've got a mild concussion and we're showing signs of hypothermia. Do you remember what happened? The flood. Mrs. Williams, Sarah. It came back in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. Mrs. Williams. He tried to sit up. Is she? My grandmother is stable. Sarah's voice came from the doorway. She looked different in dry scrubs, her hair pulled back neatly, but exhaustion lined her face. Thanks to you. The nurse finished her checks and left them alone. David noticed an IV in his arm, warming blankets covering his legs. His wet clothes had been replaced with a hospital gown. How long was I out? About 2 hours. Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed. You collapsed in my car. Between the head injury, hypothermia, and exhaustion, she shook her head. You're lucky it wasn't worse. My mom, David suddenly remembered. I need to call. Already taken care of? Sarah held up his phone, now dried out and charging. She's been notified you're here. The roads are still too flooded for her to come, but she's safe at home. I spoke with her myself. Relief flooded through him, stronger than any pain medication. Thank you. Thank you. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. You saved my grandmother's life, and you're thanking me for making a phone call? Before David could respond, a commotion outside the room drew their attention. Through the glass door, they could see hospital staff rushing past with gurneys. More flood victims coming in, Sarah explained. It's been nonstop. The storm's still raging out there. She stood up, doctor mode engaging. I need to help, but I'll check on you later. Try to rest. David watched her leave, then sank back against the pillows. His head still throbbed, but the fog was starting to clear. He reached for his phone, scrolling through dozens of missed calls and messages. The local news website showed photos of the flooding. Entire neighborhoods underwater. Rescue boats navigating streets turned to rivers. The death toll stood at 3 so far. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reading. An elderly black man in hospital maintenance coveralls stepped in. Sorry to disturb you, he said, but I heard what you did. Rescuing Rose Williams, he moved closer, his eyes serious. That's my wife you saved. David tried to sit up straighter. Mr. Williams. Harold, the man corrected. And I need you to know something. He pulled up the chair Sarah had vacated. That house you found Rose in? We've lived there 43 years. Raised our children there. Lost our son, Sarah's father, while he was serving overseas. That house is all the history we have left. He paused, emotion making his voice rough. But you showed me today that things, even precious things, they ain't worth a life. You chose my wife over everything else. There's no way I can repay that. I just did what anyone would do, David said, uncomfortable with the praise. Harold shook his head. No, son. Most people would have called 911 and hoped for the best. You jumped in. Just like... He studied David's face. You're James Parker's boy, aren't you? David stared at him. You knew my father? Worked maintenance at the same school he taught at. He used to talk about you all the time. How proud he was. Harold's eyes grew distant. I was there that night, you know. The night of the flood that took him. He went back for a family trapped in their car. Said he had to try. Even though... He cleared his throat. You're just like him. Same heart. Before David could process this revelation, the door opened again. Sarah rushed in, her face tense. Dad, we need you. The basement's flooding. All the backup generators. Harold was on his feet instantly. Where? Sublevel 2. Near the main electrical room. I'm on it. He squeezed David's shoulder as he passed. Rest up, son. We'll talk more later. Sarah lingered for a moment after her father left. The storm's getting worse. They're bringing in more patients, but if we lose power... She ran a hand through her hair. I should go help Dad. I can help. David started to push back his blankets. No. Sarah's tone left no room for argument. You're still my patient. Stay in that bed. But as soon as she left, David slowly sat up, ignoring the way the room spun. His father hadn't stayed in bed when people needed help. Neither would he. Carefully, he disconnected his and found his clothes, now mostly dry, folded in a cabinet. Every movement sent pain shooting through his bruised body, but he forced himself to focus. People needed help. That's all that mattered. He was pulling on his shoes when the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the hospital. Emergency lights kicked on, casting everything in a dim red glow. Down the hall, he could hear shouting. The beeping of medical equipment suddenly silenced. David stepped into the hallway. Nurses rushed past with flashlights, checking on patients. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying. The generators aren't responding. A voice echoed up the stairwell. Harold's voice. Water's rising too fast. Sarah appeared at the end of the hall, her scrubs now wet again. She spotted David. I told you to stay in bed. You need help, he said simply. Where's the electrical room? She started to argue, then glanced at her watch. We've got patients on ventilators running on battery backup. Those batteries last 30 minutes max. Her jaw set. Follow me. But if you feel dizzy or I won't let you down. They ran for the stairs, David pushing aside his own discomfort. As they descended, water splashed around their feet. The basement was flooding, just like the streets above. Harold's voice echoed up again. We need more sandbags. And someone find me a pump. Sarah grabbed David's arm. Ready? He nodded, remembering his father's words from long ago. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing the hard thing. Together, they pushed through the stairwell door into the flooding basement, where another battle against rising waters waited. But this time, David wasn't alone. This time, Get help. The water was already knee-deep and rising fast. Emergency lights cast ghostly shadows on the walls. And somewhere in the darkness, the clock was ticking for patients whose lives depended on the power being restored. David took a deep breath, ignoring the protest from his battered body. He'd already faced death once today. What was one more time? Besides, his father would have done the same thing. "Let's go," he said to Sarah. "Show me where you need me." The basement corridor stretched ahead like a dark tunnel, emergency lights reflecting off the rising water. David and Sarah sloshed through it, following the sound of Harold's voice. "Over here," Harold called out. They rounded a corner to find him and two other maintenance workers stacking sandbags against a door marked Main Electrical. Water seeped under the door despite their efforts. Inside, they could hear the hum of emergency systems fighting to stay alive. "The pumps aren't keeping up," Harold said, his coveralls soaked to the waist. "We need to redirect the water flow, or we'll lose everything." David studied the corridor layout. "Where does this water come from?" "Storm drain backup," one of the maintenance workers said. "Systems overwhelmed." Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, her face tightening. "ICU's got 15 patients on ventilators. Backup batteries showing 25 minutes left." David spotted a pile of unused sandbags against the wall. "We need to build a barrier." "Not here," he pointed down the corridor. "There, at the junction. Force the water toward the parking garage." Harold nodded. "That could work, but we need to move fast." "I'll help," Sarah said, already grabbing a sandbag. "You're needed upstairs," David told her. "Your patients have other doctors. Right now, keeping power on is priority one." They worked quickly, forming a chain to pass sandbags. David's muscles screamed in protest, his earlier injuries making each lift a battle. But he pushed through it, focusing on the task. 10 more, Harold called out. "Make it count." The water level had risen to mid-thigh. Each movement was a struggle against the current. David's teeth began to chatter, the cold water sapping his body heat again. Sarah noticed. "You're still recovering from hypothermia. You need to." "I'm fine." He cut her off, passing another sandbag. "Keep going." Above them, through the concrete, they could hear the storm still raging. Thunder rattled the building's foundations. The lights flickered again. "Last one," Harold announced. "Now we wait." They watched as the water hit their makeshift barrier. For a moment, it seemed to make no difference. Then, slowly, the level in their section began to drop. "It's working," Sarah breathed. The water's draining toward. A loud crack interrupted her. One of the sandbags had split, weakening their wall. Water began pushing through the gap. "No!" Harold lunged forward, trying to plug the breach with his body. More bags shifted under the pressure. David didn't think. He moved, throwing his weight against the wall beside Harold. Sarah joined them, all three pushing against the force of the water. "We need more bags," Harold shouted. "There aren't any more," the maintenance worker called back. "That was all we had." Sarah's phone buzzed again. She checked it one-handed while helping hold the wall. 20 minutes left on ventilator batteries. David's mind raced. They needed something to reinforce the barrier. Something solid, heavy. "The door," he suddenly said. "The storage room we passed." Its door was metal. Harold caught on immediately. "If we can get it off its hinges, I'll get tools," one of the workers said, splashing away. They held their position, straining against the water pressure. David's vision blurred at the edges, his concussion making itself known again. But he gritted his teeth and pushed harder. "Stay with us," Sarah said, noticing his struggle. "Just a few more minutes." The maintenance worker returned with a toolbox and another helper. Working in the dim emergency lighting, they managed to remove the storage room door. "On 3, Harold called out. 1, 2, 3. They slid the metal door in front of their failing sandbag wall. The worker quickly secured it with rope to nearby pipes. Water still leaked around the edges, but the main flow was contained. "Check the electrical room," Harold ordered. Inside, the water level was dropping. Equipment hummed steadily. They'd done it. Sarah sagged against the wall, exhausted. "That was too close." "It's not over," Harold warned. "We need to check all the critical systems, make sure nothing was damaged. And if this storm keeps up, I need to get back upstairs. Sarah pushed away from the wall. David, you should. The words cut off as David's legs gave out. Only Harold's quick reaction kept him from falling into the water. I've got him. Sarah switched to doctor mode. Dad, handle things down here. I'm taking him back to his room. I can still help, David protested, but the words came out slurred. You've helped enough, Sarah said firmly. Now it's my turn to take care of you. They made their way back to the stairs, David leaning heavily on Sarah. Each step sent pain shooting through his body. The cold had settled deep in his bones again. The ventilators? He asked as they climbed. We'll stay running, thanks to you. She helped him through the stairwell door. You know, when I first saw you in that flood, I thought you were crazy. Now I'm starting to think crazy runs in your family. David managed a weak smile. Dad always said doing the right thing meant doing the hard thing. Your dad sounds wise. She paused. I lost my father too, you know. Not to a flood. He was a Marine. Afghanistan. Her voice softened. He used to say something similar. The right path isn't always the easy one. They reached David's room. Sarah helped him back into bed, immediately checking his vital signs. Your temperature's down again, she frowned. And that head injury needs to be rechecked. What about your grandmother? David asked as she worked. Is she stable? Resting comfortably, Sarah hung a new bag. She's been asking about you. Wants to thank you properly when you're stronger. Thunder boomed outside, making the windows rattle. The storm showed no signs of weakening. You should get back to your other patients, David said. Sarah finished adjusting his Try to rest. I'll check on you again soon. She headed for the door, then paused. Thank you. Not just for saving my grandmother, but for helping down there. Not many people would have. Just doing what anyone would do. No, she said softly. You're doing what your father would do. There's a difference. After she left, David lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside. His phone lit up with another message from his mom. Please be safe, honey. I'm so proud of you. Tears pricked at his eyes. He could almost hear his father's voice. Sometimes the hardest choices show us who we really are. The hospital hummed around him, power flowing steadily now. Somewhere above, patients breathed easy thanks to working ventilators. Somewhere below, Harold and his team kept watch over their jury-rigged defenses. And outside, the rain continued to fall on Houston's flooded streets, where more people might need help before this night was through. David closed his eyes, his father's words echoing in his mind as exhaustion finally pulled him under. The right thing, the hard thing. In his dreams, he was back in the floodwaters. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time, his father swam beside him, showing him the way forward through the storm. David woke to the sound of quiet conversation. His room was dimly lit, the storm still drumming against the windows. Mrs. Williams sat in a wheelchair beside his bed, wrapped in warm blankets. Sarah stood behind her, checking something on a tablet. He's awake, Mrs. Williams said, reaching out to touch David's hand. Her skin felt warm now, no longer the frightening cold of the floodwaters. How are you feeling? Sarah asked, switching into doctor mode. She shined a penlight in his eyes, checking his pupil response. Better. David tried to sit up. His muscles ached, but the room stayed steady this time. What time is it? Just past midnight. Sarah helped him adjust the bed. The storm's still going strong. They're evacuating some parts of the city now. Mrs. Williams squeezed his hand. I never properly thanked you. When I think what could have happened. Don't, David said gently. You're safe. That's what matters. But at what cost to you? She gestured to his injuries. Your car, your apartment. Sarah told me they're both underwater now. David had been trying not to think about that. Everything he owned, probably ruined. He'd had minimal insurance. All he could afford on a personal trainer's salary. We have a spare room, Mrs. Williams continued. Once they release us, you'll stay with us. No arguments. I couldn't. You can and you will. Her tone brooked no argument. Harold's already agreed. Haven't you, dear? Harold stepped into the room, carrying coffee cups. Sure have. It's settled. David looked between them. This family he'd known for less than a day, offering him shelter without hesitation. Something tight squeezed in his chest. My mom, he started, is welcome too, Mrs. Williams said firmly. I spoke with her on the phone earlier. Lovely woman. She's very proud of you, you know? Sarah's tablet beeped. She checked it, frowning. More flooding on the first floor. Dad, I'm on it. Harold handed out the coffee cups and headed for the door. Rose, you should get back to your room, rest. I'm fine right here, Mrs. Williams said stubbornly. Someone needs to make sure this young man doesn't try anything heroic again. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Dr. Williams? They need you in the ER. More flood victims coming in. Sarah squeezed her grandmother's shoulder. I'll check on you both later. After she left, Mrs. Williams settled more comfortably in her wheelchair. That girl works too hard, just like her father did. You mentioned he was a Marine? Mrs. Williams nodded. Career military man. Could have been anything. Smart as a whip, just like Sarah. But he believed in service. In helping others. She smiled sadly. A lot like your father, from what Harold tells me. Thunder crashed outside. The lights flickered but held steady. Tell me about him, Mrs. Williams said. Your father. If you don't mind. David stared into his coffee cup. He was a high school teacher. Physics. But he was always helping people on the side. Fixing cars, rebuilding porches, whatever anyone needed. He swallowed hard. The night he died, there was a flood like this one. He went to help a family trapped in their car and never came back. Mrs. Williams' voice was gentle. Harold told me. He said your father was a hero. I was so angry at first, David admitted. Not at him, at the situation. At the fact that doing the right thing meant... He trailed off. Meant losing him. Mrs. Williams completed the thought. I felt the same way when we lost Michael, Sarah's father. He died trying to save his men. For a long time, I was angry that he chose them over coming home to his family. She adjusted her blanket. But then I realized something. He didn't choose them over us. He chose to be true to who he was, a man who helped others. Just like your father. Just like you. I'm not. You jumped into flood waters to save a stranger. She cut him off. Then, still injured, you helped save this hospital's power. Don't tell me you're not like them. David's throat felt tight. Outside, the rain continued to fall. I never wanted to be a hero, he said quietly. I just wanted to open my own gym. Help people get healthy, stay fit. Simple stuff. Nothing simple about it. You're still helping people, just in a different way. Mrs. Williams smiled. And once this is all over, Harold, and I might know some people who'd be interested in investing in a new gym, especially one run by a local hero. I'm not. Hush. She patted his hand. Let an old woman help you the way you helped her. Before David could respond, Harold rushed back in, dripping wet. Rose, we need to move you to a higher floor. Water's coming in faster than we can pump it out. Mrs. Williams straightened in her wheelchair. What about David? I'm fine. David started to get up. I can help. You'll stay right there, Mrs. Williams said firmly. Harold, make sure someone checks on him. Already arranged? Harold took the handles of her wheelchair. Sarah's coming back once she's done in the ER. They left, leaving David alone with his thoughts and the sound of the rain. His phone buzzed, another text from his mom. The Williams family called. Such wonderful people. Get some rest, sweetheart. We'll figure everything out tomorrow. He closed his eyes, remembering the weight of the flood waters, the terror and exhilaration of the rescue. His father had felt this too, he realized. This mix of fear and certainty, knowing that helping others meant risking everything. The door opened again. Sarah walked in, looking exhausted but determined. Brought you some real food, she said, setting down a sandwich. Hospital cafeteria's finest. Shouldn't you be in the ER? Taking my mandated break. She dropped into the chair her grandmother had vacated. Dad told me about the investment offer. Grandma doesn't make those lightly. David picked at the sandwich wrapper. I can't accept. Yes, you can. Sarah's voice was firm. Look, I've seen a lot of trauma cases come through the ER. Know what most people do in a crisis? They freeze. They panic. They think about themselves first. She leaned forward. You didn't. You saw someone needed help, and you acted. That's rare. I was just, if you say, doing what anyone would do. I'm ordering a psych consult. She smiled to take the sting out of her words. Accept the help, David. You've earned it. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm wasn't done with Houston yet. Your grandmother, David said, changing the subject. She's something else. Stubborn as they come. Sarah's smile turned fond. Been that way since I was little. After Dad died, she's the one who pushed me to keep going, to finish medical school. She checked her watch. Speaking of, I should check on her. Go. David gestured to the door. I'm not going anywhere. Sarah stood, then hesitated. Thank you. Not just for saving her, but seeing you push through today, helping despite your injuries. It reminded me of my dad, of why I became a doctor. She left before David could respond. He sat in the darkness, listening to the storm, thinking about fathers and children, about legacy and choice, about doing the right thing, especially when it was the hard thing. His phone lit up with another weather alert. Flood warning extended. Heavy rain continues. David closed his eyes, knowing that somewhere in the hospital, Sarah was tending to patients, Harold was fighting the rising waters, and Mrs. Williams was probably still trying to take care of everyone else despite her own condition. And he realized that maybe this was what his father had known all along, that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures or conscious choices. It was about being unable to do anything else when someone needed help. The storm raged on outside, but in that moment, David felt more at peace than he had in years. The first rays of dawn crept through the hospital windows, painting the walls in pale gold. The rain had finally stopped, though water still stood in the streets below. David watched from his bed as emergency vehicles navigated the flooded roads, their lights reflecting off the surface like scattered rubies. Sarah burst into his room, her scrubs splattered with mud and worse. You're being discharged. David sat up, wincing at his stiff muscles. What about your grandmother? Also cleared to leave. She ran a hand through her disheveled hair. The hospital needs all available beds. We got people coming in from all over the city. How bad is it out there? Bad. She helped him gather his few belongings. But it could have been worse. The death toll. She paused. Let's just say a lot of people did what you did. Help their neighbors. Save lives. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Harold appeared, pushing Mrs. Williams in a wheelchair. She looked better, color in her cheeks, strength in her spine. There's my hero, she said, smiling at David. Ready to come home with us? Before David could respond, his phone rang. His mother's name flashed on the screen. Mom? Are you okay? I'm fine, honey. Her voice cracked with emotion. The Williams family sent someone to check on me. Can you believe it? A complete stranger shows up with food and emergency supplies. Says they're friends of yours. David looked at Mrs. Williams, who simply winked. Listen, Mom, he said. They've offered to let us stay with them until... I know. Mrs. Williams already called me. Such a wonderful woman. She paused. I'm so proud of you, David. Your father would be too. The words hit him like a physical force. He had to swallow hard before he could speak again. I'll see you soon, Mom. Love you. Harold cleared his throat after David hung up. Cars waiting outside. Sarah, you coming? Can't. Still on shift. She checked David's vitals one last time. But I'll stop by later. Someone needs to make sure you're actually resting. They made their way down to the hospital entrance, where an SUV waited in the driveway. The morning light revealed the storm's devastation. Fallen trees, scattered debris, water standing in every low spot. As Harold helped Mrs. Williams into the car, a news van pulled up. A reporter jumped out, camera crew in tow. Excuse me, she called out. Are you David Parker? The man who saved. No comment, Harold said firmly, stepping between David and the camera. Family only. Family. The word echoed in David's mind as they drove through the flooded streets. Mrs. Williams chatted from the back seat, pointing out landmarks, telling stories about the neighborhood's history. Harold focused on navigating the tricky roads, occasionally adding details to his wife's tales. They turned onto Oak Lane, the street where it had all started. The water level had dropped, revealing the extent of the damage. David's throat tightened as they passed his car, still parked on high ground but clearly flooded. Don't worry about that, Harold said, noticing his expression. I know a good mechanic. We'll get it running again. They pulled up to the Williams house. The porch, what was left of it, bore testament to the previous day's drama. But the house itself stood solid, its brick walls defying the flood's assault. Home sweet home, Mrs. Williams announced as Harold helped her out of the car. David, Your room's upstairs. Harold, show him. Rose. A voice called from next door. An elderly woman hurried over, concern etched on her face. We were so worried when we saw the porch collapse. Soon, more neighbors appeared. Word spread quickly. Rose Williams was home, and with her was the young man who'd saved her life. People brought food, offered help with repairs, shared their own storm stories. David tried to fade into the background, but Mrs. Williams wouldn't have it. She kept him close, introducing him to everyone, though she respected his obvious discomfort with being called a hero. Mrs. Martinez across the street needs her basement pumped out, Harold mentioned as they finally made it inside. Thought you might want to help once you've rested. David recognized the offer for what it was, a chance to help without fanfare, to be useful without being in the spotlight. Just let me get changed, he said. Upstairs, the guest room was small but comfortable. Someone had left fresh clothes on the bed, new jeans and shirts that looked about his size. Another of Mrs. Williams' mysterious arrangements, no doubt. David's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Grandma better not have you doing manual labor yet. Doctor's orders. Rest. He smiled, typing back. Your dad already has me signed up for basement duty. Her response came quickly. Of course he does. Williams' family tradition. Help first, rest later. Speaking of, got another 12-hour shift. Someone has to keep this hospital running. A knock at the door interrupted his reply. Harold stood there with a tool belt and work gloves. Ready whenever you are, he said. But first, there's someone here to see you. Downstairs, a man in an expensive suit stood in the living room. Talking quietly with Mrs. Williams, she brightened when she saw David. David, this is Mr. Chun. He owns several businesses in the area, including that nice gym over on Marshall Street. Mr. Chin stepped forward, hand extended. Mrs. Williams told me what you did yesterday. Not just saving her, but helping at the hospital too. He glanced at her. She also mentioned you're interested in opening your own gym. David's heart skipped. I've been trying to get a loan. Forget loans. Mr. Chin pulled out a business card. I've been looking to expand, bring in fresh blood. Someone who understands his community. Someone who leads by example. He smiled. Someone like you? Mrs. Williams beamed from her chair. Harold stood in the doorway, trying to hide his own smile. David stared at the card in his hand. This is too much. You don't even know me. I know enough, Mr. Chin said simply. I know what you did when things were at their worst. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. He headed for the door. Call me when you're ready to talk details. After he left, David turned to Mrs. Williams. Did you arrange this? I just made a few calls. She waved dismissively. People around here, we take care of our own. And you, David Parker, are now one of our own. Harold cleared his throat. Mrs. Martinez's basement won't pump itself out. Go, Mrs. Williams said. But be careful with those muscles. Sarah will have my head if you overdo it. As David followed Harold out into the sun-brightened street, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope, not just for himself, but for everything the future might hold. His phone buzzed again, another text from Sarah. Fair warning, Grandma's probably already planning your future. She does that. Best to just go along with it. David looked back at the house, where Mrs. Williams watched from the window. At Harold, waiting patiently with his tools. At the neighborhood around them, already working together to rebuild. Already am, he texted back. Then, pocketing his phone, he followed Harold toward their next task, ready to help however he could. 2 weeks after the flood, David stood in an empty warehouse on Marshall Street, sunlight streaming through newly cleaned windows. The space smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Mr. Chin walked beside him, pointing out features. Loading dock can be converted to a CrossFit area, he said. Main floor is perfect for traditional equipment. Upstairs, he gestured to a mezzanine level. Private training spaces, maybe a yoga studio. David ran his hand along a support column. The price tag is my concern. Mr. Chun checked something on his tablet. Your concern is making this place the best gym in the 3rd Ward. Think you can handle that? Before David could answer, the warehouse door opened. Sarah walked in, still in scrubs from her hospital shift. Sorry I'm late, she said. Multiple traumas came in right at shift change. She looked around. This is it? David couldn't keep the excitement from his voice. What do you think? Sarah walked the space, her doctor's eye taking in details. Good natural light. High ceilings. Decent ventilation. She smiled. I think it's perfect. As do I. A voice called from the entrance. Mrs. Williams rolled in, pushed by Harold. She'd insisted on coming to see the space, despite Sarah's protests about her still recovering. Mom, Sarah sighed, you're supposed to be resting. I've rested enough. Mrs. Williams waved her off. Besides, I need to see where I'll be doing my physical therapy. David turned to her, surprised. You're what? Well, you'll need clients, won't you? She gestured around. And I'll need to rebuild my strength. Seems like a perfect match. Mr. Chin chuckled. I see why you speak so highly of her, Sarah. He handed David a folder. Preliminary paperwork. Look it over, but don't take too long. Property like this doesn't stay available forever. After he left, Harold pulled out a measuring tape. Need to check those support beams if we're going to mount equipment. He looked at David. Unless you'd rather hire outside contractors? No, David said quickly. I'd rather work with people I trust. They spent the next hour taking measurements, discussing layouts, planning renovations. Sarah contributed ideas about medical equipment and injury prevention. Mrs. Williams held court from her wheelchair, offering opinions on everything from paint colors to membership structures. David's phone buzzed his mother. Apartments finally dried out. Most furniture's ruined, but found Dad's old teaching awards. Bringing them to the Williams house. He smiled, remembering how easily his mother had fit into the Williams household over the past 2 weeks. She and Mrs. Williams had become fast friends, sharing stories and recipes, tag-teaming to make sure everyone was fed and cared for. David. Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. You okay? Yeah, He gestured around the warehouse. All this. 2 weeks ago, I couldn't even get a loan. Now you've got people in your corner. She squeezed his arm. Get used to it. Harold called them over to look at the electrical panel. As Sarah offered input about power requirements for medical equipment, David watched them. This unlikely family he'd found in the floodwaters. The warehouse door opened again. A group of people walked in. Some of the neighbors they'd helped after the storm, others from the hospital. Thought you could use some extra hands, Mrs. Martinez said, rolling up her sleeves. Her basement had been the first they'd helped pump out. Just tell us where you need us. More people arrived throughout the afternoon. Someone brought pizza. Someone else set up a portable radio. The empty warehouse filled with voices, laughter, the sounds of work and planning. David's phone buzzed again, a text from Mr. Chin. See what I mean about community? This is why I chose you. Harold appeared at David's side, wiping sweat from his forehead. Reminds me of the old days. When neighbors helped neighbors, no questions asked. Like they did during the flood? Exactly. Harold watched as his wife directed traffic from her wheelchair, organizing work crews with military precision. Sometimes it takes a disaster to remind us who we really are. Sarah joined them, checking a message on her phone. Hospitals sending over some surplus equipment. Rehab stuff they were going to replace anyway. She grinned. Amazing what you can get when people pull together. The afternoon turned to evening. Pizza boxes emptied. Paint samples were debated. Equipment layouts were sketched and revised. Through it all, David moved through the space, thanking helpers, answering questions, slowly seeing his dream take shape. You know, Sarah said as the last volunteers headed out, I could set up a part-time sports medicine clinic here. 1 or 2 days a week. David looked at her. You do that. Why not? Community needs it. You need it? She smiled. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on Grandma during her workouts. I heard that. Mrs. Williams called from across the room. Just for that, you're both joining me for Sunday dinner. No excuses. Harold chuckled. Better say yes. She'll only keep asking until you do. David watched as Harold helped Mrs. Williams into their car, Sarah following with her medical bag. The setting sun painted the warehouse windows gold, like the morning after the flood. His phone buzzed one last time, another text from his mother. Found something else in the apartment. Your father's old business plan for the gym he wanted to open before he took the teaching job. Thought you might want to see it. Something tightened in David's chest. He looked around the warehouse, at the plans scattered across makeshift tables, at the paint samples taped to walls, at the empty space slowly transforming into something new. "You okay?" Sarah asked, coming back inside. "Yeah." David pocketed his phone. "Just thinking about Dad. About choices." She nodded, understanding. "The right path isn't always the easy one. But sometimes," he said, "it leads exactly where you need to go." They locked up the warehouse together. Outside, the street was busy with evening traffic. The flood scars were still visible. Water lines on buildings, piles of debris awaiting removal. But there were signs of renewal too. New construction, fresh paint, neighbors helping neighbors. "Dinner?" Sarah asked. "I know a place that survived the flood. Great takeout." David looked at her. This woman who'd gone from stranger to friend in 2 weeks of shared crisis and recovery. At the warehouse behind them, full of possibilities. At the community around them, rebuilt by countless small acts of courage and kindness. "Dinner sounds perfect," he said. As they walked away, David thought about floods and choices, about fathers and legacy, about the strange ways disaster could lead to destiny. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a struggling personal trainer with a denied loan application. Now he had everything his father had tried to teach him about: purpose, community, family. All it took was the courage to dive into dark waters, to reach out when someone needed help. His phone buzzed again. "Mrs. Williams this time. Don't forget, you're both expected at 1 o'clock sharp on Sunday." "And David?" "Bring those building plans. We have work to do." David smiled, typing back a quick response. Then he turned to Sarah, ready to hear about her day, ready to plan tomorrow's work, ready for whatever came next. The sun set on Houston's 3rd Ward, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Not a threat now, but a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the worst storms brought the best out of people. A reminder that family wasn't always about blood. A reminder that doing the right thing, the hard thing, could lead to places you never expected to go. 3 months after the flood, David stood in front of Parker's Community Fitness, watching the sunrise reflect off the newly installed sign. The warehouse's transformation was complete. Fresh paint, new equipment, spaces designed for everyone from athletes to seniors. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, appearing beside him with 2 coffee cups. She'd started bringing coffee every morning before her hospital shifts, claiming it was on her way, though David knew the hospital was in the opposite direction. "A little." He accepted the coffee. "What if nobody comes?" "Right, because the 60 people who pre-registered don't count?" She bumped his shoulder with hers. "Face it, Parker. You're stuck with us." The door chimed behind them. Harold walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Final equipment checks done. Everything's ready." David nodded, thinking about the last 3 months. The community had rallied around the gym's renovation. Painters, electricians, carpenters, all offering their services at reduced rates or free. Even his old clients had pitched in, spreading the word and signing up for memberships in advance. "Your father would be proud," a voice said. David's mother approached, carrying a framed photo. "This should go in your office." The photo showed his father in front of his high school physics classroom, surrounded by students. His smile was the same one David saw in the mirror every morning. "Perfect spot for it," Harold said. He'd helped David set up the office, insisting on doing the wiring himself. Right where everyone can see it. More people began arriving. Mrs. Martinez and her walking group. They'd booked the first senior fitness class. Some of David's old clients. Hospital staff Sarah had recruited. Mr. Chun, looking pleased with his investment. And there, rolling up in her wheelchair despite the early hour, was Mrs. Williams. "Didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" she called out. She looked stronger now, 3 months of physical therapy showing results. "Sarah, help me up. If I'm going to cut this ribbon, I'm going to do it standing." Sarah rushed to help her grandmother. Together, they got Mrs. Williams on her feet, supporting her on both sides. Someone handed her a large pair of scissors. "Speech," someone called from the crowd. Mrs. Williams shook her head. "No speeches. Just this." She looked at David. 3 months ago, a young man risked his life to save a foolish old woman who didn't evacuate when she should have. Today, That same young man opens a business that will help our whole community stay strong and healthy. She smiled. Sometimes the worst storms bring the best blessings. The ribbon fell. Applause erupted. People began filing into the gym, exclaiming over the equipment, the layout, the overall feel of the place. David led his first class, a mix of old clients and new faces. Through the glass walls of the training room, he could see Mrs. Williams working with a physical therapist in the rehab area Sarah had set up. Harold was showing someone how to use a weight machine. His mother staffed the front desk, greeting everyone by name. The morning flew by. People came and went, worked out, signed up for memberships. The energy was exactly what David had always dreamed of, not just a gym, but a community center, a place where everyone belonged. During a brief break, he found Sarah in her clinic space, organizing supplies. "Busy morning?" he asked. "3 consultations already." She looked around the small but well-equipped room. "This is going to work, David. Really work." Before he could respond, a commotion at the front desk drew their attention. A group of firefighters had walked in, led by their captain. "We heard about what you did during the flood," the captain said to David. "Thought maybe we could set up a training program here. Keep our people in shape, support a local business." More good news followed throughout the day. The high school wanted to discuss an after-school program. A senior center inquired about specialized classes. A veterans group asked about rehabilitation services. By closing time, David's head was spinning. He sat in his office, looking at his father's photo, when a knock came at the door. "Got a minute?" Harold asked. "There's something you should see." He led David to the gym's entrance. Outside, someone had set up a projector screen. The evening news was playing, showing footage from the flood. "Watch," Harold said. The news story showed various rescue efforts during the storm. And there, in grainy cell phone footage, was David swimming through the flood waters toward Mrs. Williams's porch. Today marks 3 months since the devastating floods that hit Houston's 3rd Ward, the reporter said. But out of that disaster came stories of hope and heroism. One such story culminates today with the opening of Parker's Community Fitness, a new gym founded by David Parker, who risked his life to save elderly resident Rose Williams. The story continued, showing clips from today's opening, interviews with community members, shots of the renovated space. "Your father did the same thing, you know," Harold said quietly. "Jumped in without thinking, just trying to help. The difference is you got a chance, he didn't, a chance to keep helping, to build something lasting." David stared at the screen, at the flood waters that had changed everything. "I never wanted to be on the news." "No." Harold smiled. "You just wanted to help. Like father, like son." They went back inside. The gym was quiet now, equipment gleaming in the evening light. But signs of life were everywhere. Water bottles forgotten by excited clients, towels waiting to be washed, class schedules posted on walls. Sarah appeared in workout clothes. "Ready for my session, trainer?" "Now." "We're closed." Perfect time for the staff workout. She gestured behind her, where Mrs. Williams rolled in, followed by Harold and David's mother. "Can't have the employees getting out of shape." "We bring dinner after," Mrs. Williams added. "Non-negotiable." David looked at them. This family forged in flood waters, strengthened through shared purpose. At the gym around them, proof that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes. "All right," he said, reaching for a clipboard. "Let's see what you've got." They worked out together as the sun set outside. Through the windows, David could see the 3rd Ward coming alive with evening activity. People walking dogs, kids playing, neighbors talking on porches. Life moving forward. His phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Chin. Saw the news. "Good publicity. Better story." "You did good, kid." David watched Mrs. Williams do her physical therapy exercises, determination in every movement. Watched Sarah spot her grandmother with professional care and personal love. Watched Harold and his mother discuss plans for community outreach programs 3 months ago. He'd been a struggling personal trainer with a denied loan application. Now he had a business, a purpose, and most importantly, a family that had chosen him as much as he'd chosen them. "You know what this means," Mrs. Williams said as they finished their workout. "Sunday dinner's going to need a bigger table." David smiled, thinking of crowded dinners filled with laughter and plans, of early morning coffee with Sarah, of Harold's constant support, of his mother's renewed happiness, of a community that had come together in crisis and stayed together in recovery. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. Outside, clouds gathered for an evening shower. Just rain this time, nothing dangerous. But David didn't fear the storms anymore. He knew now what his father had known, what the flood had taught him, that in our worst moments, we often find our best selves. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we find family too. The gym's lights reflected off the rain-slick streets as they left together. Sarah and Mrs. Williams sharing an umbrella, Harold helping with the wheelchair, David's mother locking up. Just another evening in the Third Ward, where a random act of courage had led to something permanent and precious. Family, purpose, home. Sometimes the worst storms brought the best blessings indeed.